Prosody. There's a question almost everyone who's survived a narcissistic relationship eventually asks, often in their most private prosody. Most difficult moments, if there's a God, if there's some higher order to existence, prosody. Why would this specific kind of suffering be allowed to happen at all? Today, prosody. We're going to explore one meaningful way of understanding this question, not as definitive theological answer, prosody, but as a perspective many people who've walked this exact path have found genuinely helpful in making sense of what they survived, prosody. Let's start with the first possibility worth considering, one that doesn't require believing suffering was directly sent or designed, prosody, but simply that meaning can be found within it regardless of its origin. The first possibility, prosody. The relationship revealed capacities within you that might never have otherwise been discovered, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about what genuine healing eventually produces. The depth of perception, prosody. The hard-won self-trust, the discernment that now protects you permanently in every future relationship, prosody. Many people who've walked this path eventually recognize something worth naming, directly certain capacities within themselves. Resilience, prosody. Perception, genuine wisdom about human nature. Simply weren't accessible before this specific kind of difficulty forced their development, prosody. This doesn't require believing the suffering was orchestrated specifically to produce this growth. It simply means that difficulty, once survived, prosody, can become the specific ground from which genuine transformation eventually grows. Transformation that considerably easier circumstances might never have required or produced. The second possibility, prosody. The experience taught you to recognize a pattern you can now help others avoid or escape, prosody. Remember what we've traced throughout this entire series about pattern recognition serving as permanent, protective wisdom, prosody, extending far beyond any single relationship into every future interaction where similar dynamics might attempt to establish themselves again, prosody. Many people find genuine meaning in recognizing that their own difficult journey equipped them with specific understanding of manipulation, of narcissistic psychology, of exactly the patterns this entire series has traced across dozens of conversations that they're now positioned to offer other people, navigating exactly the same confusion and pain you once experienced without any guide or any framework for understanding what was actually happening. The third possibility, the relationship, however painful, prosody, ultimately redirected you toward a life more genuinely aligned with who you actually are, prosody. This connects to something we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic relationships often occur specifically when certain vulnerabilities remain unaddressed. Old wounds, prosody. Old patterns of self-abandonment, old beliefs about what love requires, prosody. Many people eventually recognize that surviving this specific relationship, painful as it genuinely was, prosody, ultimately forced confrontation with exactly these underlying patterns, producing a level of self-understanding and self-respect that a considerably easier, prosody, more comfortable life might never have required them to develop. The fourth possibility, suffering itself, prosody, rather than being specifically designed or sent, is simply woven into the nature of a world where genuine free will exists. This represents a different, though equally meaningful, way many people understand this question. If genuine free will genuinely exists, prosody, then some people will genuinely choose to cause harm, and this possibility cannot be selectively removed without removing free will itself. Under this understanding, relevant question shifts from why was this allowed to happen specifically to me, toward how do I find meaning and growth within a world that necessarily includes this possibility, which connects directly to everything this entire series is traced about the genuine transformation available on the other side of exactly this kind of difficult experience. This kind of difficult experience, prosody. Let's continue exploring this question, examining several additional perspectives worth considering. because no single framework fully captures something as genuinely complex as suffering's place in a meaningful existence. The fifth possibility, prosody. The relationship served as a specific, unmistakable teacher about the difference between genuine and counterfeit love. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the crucial distinction between attention and love. Prosody. Examined extensively throughout our conversation about why narcissists need attention more than love. Prosody. Many people who've survived this specific kind of relationship eventually recognize something worth naming directly, without this painful prosody. Direct experience of counterfeit love. Genuine love might have remained difficult to recognize when it eventually arrived. Prosody. Simply because you'd never experienced the sharp, unmistakable contrast that surviving something false provides. Some lessons. Prosody. However painful their delivery, teach with a clarity that comfortable circumstances simply cannot replicate. The sixth possibility, prosody. Your specific suffering, witnessed and understood by others navigating similar circumstances, prosody, becomes a source of genuine comfort and genuine solidarity for people who would otherwise feel entirely alone. This connects to something worth understanding beyond simply the practical helping we traced in the previous section, prosody. There's something considerably more foundational available here, the simple prosody. Profound comfort of knowing you're not alone in what you've experienced, that someone else has walked exactly this path and survived it, prosody. Arriving somewhere genuinely whole on the other side. Many people find that their own difficult journey, once shared honestly, prosody, provides exactly this comfort to others, a form of meaning that requires the suffering to have genuinely fully happened in order to offer this specific, authentic solidarity. The seventh possibility. This specific difficulty exists as one thread within a considerably larger tapestry, prosody, one whose full pattern and full meaning may simply not be visible from within any single lifetime or any single perspective, prosody. This represents a different kind of understanding, one that doesn't require identifying a specific, prosody, articulable purpose in order to find genuine peace. Many people, particularly after considerable time has passed, prosody, arrive at something closer to trust than to explanation, not necessarily believing they can fully articulate why this specific suffering occurred, but trusting that within whatever larger order exists, prosody, their own difficult experience holds a place and a meaning even if its full shape remains genuinely beyond what any single person could fully perceive or fully explain. Here's something worth understanding about why holding multiple possibilities simultaneously, prosody, rather than committing rigidly to any single explanation, often serves people considerably better than searching for one definitive answer, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the value of holding complexity rather than reaching for oversimplified resolution, prosody. The question of why suffering exists at all represents one of the oldest, most genuinely difficult questions available to human contemplation, prosody. One that countless traditions and countless individual seekers have approached from many different angles without ever arriving at a single, universally satisfying answer. This doesn't mean the question isn't worth exploring, prosody. It means that genuine peace with this question often arrives not through finding the one correct explanation, but through developing a flexible, prosody, personal relationship with several possible explanations, drawing comfort from whichever resonates most authentically in any given moment, prosody, rather than requiring rigid, permanent commitment to only one, prosody. Here's something crucial worth understanding about how this exploration connects back to everything this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations regarding practical psychological healing, prosody. Remember everything we've established about grief requiring genuine space, about the danger of bypassing difficult emotions in favor of premature spiritual sounding acceptance. These 7 possibilities are worth exploring genuinely and honestly, prosody. But they were never meant to substitute for or bypass the practical, prosody, Psychological healing work this entire series has traced extensively. The grief fully processed, the self-trust rebuilt, the boundaries genuinely established, spiritual or philosophical meaning, making works best alongside this practical work, prosody, not as a replacement for it, offering a broader context within which the more immediate, practical healing can continue unfolding, prosody. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, prosody. And it's worth being direct about it, rather than leaving this conversation as simply a list of philosophical possibilities without addressing what genuinely matters most, prosody. How to actually hold this entire question in a way that serves your continued healing, prosody. Rather than becoming either a source of ongoing spiritual anxiety or a bypass that prevents the practical work this entire series has traced from actually occurring, prosody. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something worth naming directly, prosody, because it addresses a specific trap this kind of spiritual exploration sometimes creates, prosody. If exploring why this suffering was allowed to happen becomes a way of avoiding accountability, prosody, particularly avoiding your own accountability to yourself regarding the practical steps genuine healing actually requires, this exploration has been misapplied, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between genuine meaning, making and spiritual bypass. The tendency to reach for elevated, philosophical language specifically to avoid the harder, more uncomfortable work of genuine grief, genuine boundary setting, genuine practical protection against future harm, prosody. None of the 7 possibilities we've traced throughout today's conversation were meant to suggest that suffering should simply be accepted passively, prosody, without also doing everything this entire series has established as necessary for actual, practical healing and protection. Here's the second thing worth understanding, prosody, one that offers a genuinely useful way to hold these philosophical questions alongside the practical work, prosody. Consider these 7 possibilities not as final answers requiring your permanent commitment, prosody, but as different lenses you can pick up and set down as they genuinely serve you at different moments throughout your continued healing journey, prosody. Some days, the possibility that your suffering equipped you to help others might resonate most deeply. Other days, simple trust in a larger, prosody, currently invisible pattern might offer more genuine comfort. Still other days, prosody, none of these philosophical framings might feel particularly relevant at all, and that's genuinely fine too. The practical, prosody, psychological work this entire series has traced throughout dozens of previous conversations remains valuable and necessary regardless of whether you're currently finding these broader philosophical questions personally meaningful or not. Here's the third thing worth understanding, prosody, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms, prosody. Whatever meaning you eventually find, or don't find, in this specific question doesn't change what you already, prosody, practically know about how to protect yourself moving forward, prosody. Remember everything we've traced extensively throughout this entire series about the practical wisdom developed through this experience. The pattern recognition, the rebuilt self-trust, the genuine discernment, prosody. This practical wisdom remains exactly as valuable and exactly as protective regardless of whether you ever arrive at complete philosophical peace with the question of why this specific suffering was allowed to occur. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, prosody, one that offers something genuinely important to hold alongside whatever philosophical framework you find most personally meaningful, prosody. If you're currently still deeply angry, still genuinely struggling with this question, prosody, still unable to find any comfort in any of the 7 possibilities we've traced throughout today's conversation, prosody, this represents completely legitimate, completely valid experience, not spiritual failure requiring correction, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about giving genuine space to difficult emotions rather than rushing toward premature acceptance, prosody. Some people find genuine peace with this question relatively quickly. Others carry it unresolved for years. Prosody. Continuing to function and continuing to heal in every practical sense, while this specific philosophical question remains genuinely prosody. Honestly open. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation: prosody. Whether you find genuine, lasting comfort in any of the 7 possibilities we've explored throughout today's discussion, prosody, or whether this question remains genuinely, honestly unresolved for you regardless of how much you contemplate it, prosody, your practical healing, the grief work, the rebuilt self-trust, the genuine boundaries, prosody. Everything this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations doesn't actually depend on resolving this specific question first, prosody. You're allowed to continue healing practically while this larger, philosophical question remains genuinely open, unanswered, and honestly uncertain. This is ultimately the most honest, most useful conclusion available for a question this genuinely difficult, prosody. Whatever meaning eventually emerges from what you survive, prosody. Whether through one of these 7 possibilities, or through something entirely your own that these frameworks haven't captured. That meaning belongs entirely to you, developed on your own timeline, prosody, held with whatever combination of certainty and genuine uncertainty feels authentic to your own experience. The suffering was real, prosody. The healing available on the other side of it is equally real, prosody. And the question of why any of it was allowed to happen in the first place remains exactly what it's always been for anyone who's genuinely grappled with it, prosody. Not a question requiring one final, correct answer, but a genuine, ongoing conversation you're allowed to continue having with yourself, prosody. With whatever you understand of the divine, and with your own continued, unfolding life, prosody. For as long as it genuinely takes to find whatever peace eventually becomes available to you. There's one more dimension worth adding here, prosody. Because it addresses something practical many people wonder about once they've genuinely absorbed everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. What happens to this entire question once genuine, practical healing has actually substantially progressed, prosody? Does the spiritual question eventually resolve on its own once the psychological work has been done, prosody? Or does it remain a genuinely separate inquiry that continues independent of practical healing's progress? Here's an honest observation worth sharing directly, prosody, drawn from what many people report experiencing as they move considerably further along their healing journey. Often, though not universally, the intensity of this specific question, why was I allowed to suffer this way, genuinely softens as practical healing deepens. Not because the philosophical question has been definitively answered, prosody, but because its urgency naturally decreases once the practical wounds it was originally attached to have genuinely, substantially healed. This is worth understanding as a hopeful, though not guaranteed, pattern. You don't necessarily need to resolve this question completely before finding genuine peace, prosody. Sometimes genuine peace simply arrives through the practical healing process itself, prosody. Gradually loosening this question's grip, even without providing the definitive answer you might have initially believed you needed, prosody. Here's something worth understanding about a specific danger worth naming directly, prosody. One that connects to something we touched on earlier, but that deserves fuller examination, prosody. If you find yourself using the exploration of why God allowed this as a way of assigning cosmic purpose specifically to justify or minimize what happened, it's worth examining this tendency honestly, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about disrespect that should never be forgiven, prosody. About the importance of holding accurate, unrevised clarity about what actually occurred rather than softening it into something more palatable, prosody. Finding meaning in suffering doesn't require believing the suffering itself was good, deserved, prosody, or something you should be grateful specifically happened. You can hold genuine gratitude for the growth and wisdom that eventually emerged, prosody, while simultaneously maintaining complete, accurate clarity that the harm itself was genuinely wrong, genuinely unnecessary, prosody, and genuinely something no one should have to experience in order to develop the wisdom that eventually resulted from surviving it. Here's a related consideration worth understanding, prosody, one that addresses something important about how this specific philosophical exploration should relate to accountability for the person who actually caused the harm. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between understanding a mechanism and excusing the behavior it produces, prosody. Finding spiritual meaning in your own survival and your own eventual growth doesn't require extending any additional grace or any additional understanding toward the specific person whose choices caused this suffering. Prosody, the meaning you find belongs entirely to your own journey, prosody, your own relationship with whatever you understand of the divine or the larger order of existence, prosody. It doesn't require reframing his behavior as somehow serving a higher purpose that excuses or diminishes his own personal responsibility for the choices he made. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, prosody, one that addresses something genuinely important about how to actually live with this question ongoing, prosody, rather than treating today's conversation as though it should produce final, permanent resolution, prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about genuine healing unfolding gradually, prosody, through accumulated practice and accumulated time, rather than arriving through any single conversation or any single moment of understanding. This specific question, why suffering exists, why it was allowed in your specific case, likely deserves the same patient, prosody, ongoing relationship you've developed with every other aspect of your healing throughout this entire series. Some days, prosody, you might feel genuinely at peace with one of the 7 possibilities we've explored throughout today's conversation. Other days, prosody, genuine frustration or genuine anger toward the entire question might resurface, and this resurfacing doesn't represent regression or failure, prosody. It represents the natural, ongoing texture of genuinely grappling with one of the most difficult questions available to human experience, one that even people with decades of spiritual practice and decades of philosophical contemplation continue wrestling with throughout their entire lives, prosody, without necessarily ever arriving at complete, permanent resolution. This is ultimately the most honest way to close this entire conversation, prosody. You're not required to have a final, complete answer to why this specific suffering was allowed to happen, prosody. You're allowed to hold genuine uncertainty alongside genuine, practical healing, prosody. Allowed to find partial comfort in some of the possibilities we've traced throughout today's discussion while remaining genuinely unconvinced by others, prosody. Allowed to change your mind about which framework resonates most as your own understanding continues developing over time. What matters most, prosody, ultimately, isn't arriving at the single correct philosophical answer. What matters is that you continue doing the practical work. The grief, prosody, the boundaries, the rebuilt self-trust that this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations, while allowing this larger, prosody, spiritual question to remain exactly what it's always been for anyone genuinely grappling with it, honestly and ongoing, prosody. Evolving conversation you're allowed to continue having, for as long as you need to have it, prosody, without requiring its resolution as a prerequisite for the genuine peace and genuine wholeness that practical healing, on its own, remains fully capable of providing.